Diffusion, there are basically two types of diffusion: simple diffusion and primary precipitated diffusion. In the simple diffusion, lipid soluble substances they crosses through the intercellular spaces or the pores present in the membrane. But in the case with facilitated diffusion, it's like they need the carrier protein and even the protein channels. The substances passing through the facilitated diffusion, they pass through the pores or channels in the proteins. And these proteins have got the gatings, right, to control the facilitated diffusion. Okay, let me write it down. Diffusion. It can be simple. It can be facilitated. This is for the lipid soluble substances. This is for lipid insoluble and for water. For the simple diffusion that occurs to the intercellular spaces, and or the pores in membrane, and the facilitated they occur through the carrier protein, or it occurs with the help of pores or channels in membrane protein. Okay. There is gating system for the facilitated diffusion in the channels or pores in the membrane protein, right? The gatings, we have got two types of gating. One is voltage gating, and the next one is chemical or ligand gating. Okay. Well, if the concentration of the diffusing particle increases, it increases the rate of diffusion. This type of diffusion, simple diffusion. But in spite of increase of concentration of diffusion particle, it doesn't increases the rate of facilitated diffusion, and the rate of diffusion cannot cross the maximum velocity. This is Vmax, right, for facilitated. In spite of increasing concentration of diffusing substances, velocity of diffusion can cross about Vmax. Simple diffusion is for like substances like oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, alcohol, right? They just gets dissolved in the lipid bilayer and then make their way across the cell membrane. Okay. You see the osmolarity. The osmolarity of the extracellular and intracellular fluid is like 300 milliosmoles per kilogram of water, right? 300 milliosmoles per kilogram of water. This is the osmolarity of the extracellular and intracellular fluid. Okay, let's come to the active transport. When we say active transport, it's either against the concentration gradient, or it's maybe either against the electrical gradient, or it may be even against the pressure gradient. Active transport against concentration gradient, or it may be against electrical gradient, or it may be against pressure gradient. When we say active transport, it is generally two types, like primary active transport and secondary active transport. And even in the secondary active transport, we have got like secondary core transport and secondary counter transport, right? Okay, let me give some examples for the primary active transport. Primary active transport is the transport of sodium, potassium bomb, and calcium bomb, the hydrogen, right? Hydrogen ions. All of us know that in the extracellular field, sodium ions, its concentration is greater, right? So it naturally, through the diffusion, it crosses the membrane and enters the intercellular field. But it still, there is great significance and importance of sodium ions outside the cell. So again, to move the sodium ions across the cell membrane against its concentration, we need energy, right? So with that, the system mechanism involved is primary active transport. And calcium pump, it's very important to maintain its low concentration in the intercellular field. And hydrogen ions is generally important for the secretion of gastric juice in the intestine, and thus secretion of hydrogen ions in our excretory system in the renal tubules. Okay, secondary core transport. Secondary core transport. Let me give you example. It's the transport of glucose. Just example, glucose or amino acids, right? Amino acids with sodium. It's like, suppose sodium is on the exterior side of the cell, right? And along with sodium, either glucose or amino acid, it gets attached to the carrier protein, right? And just pass across the cell membrane in the same direction, like sodium and amino acid, they travel in the same direction, okay? And this secondary transport, either they use the energy, not directly, but maybe they may use the energy from the primary active transport as well. Now let me give the example of secondary counter transport. Secondary counter transport. It's basically, counter transport is basically the transport of calcium or hydrogen ions, right, with sodium in opposite directions. Okay, now let's discuss the last topic. It's the active transport across the seat, right? That means first, on the first surface of the cell, the substance passes to the active transport, right? And when it goes to the next side of the cell, the transport occurs through the diffusion, maybe simple diffusion or even the facilitated diffusion. So the active transport through the seat. Active transport. And this active transport occurs in like our exocrine cells, our intestinal cells, right, in our renal cells. So first, the active transport occurs on one side of cell membrane, right, and then maybe facilitated or simple diffusion on other side.